Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. US and other Western troops are meant to be quitting Afghanistan next year. In today's programme, we'll be looking at the condition of the country that they'll leave behind. And we'll also be examining the impact on the region and on the NATO powers themselves. So, after tens of thousands of lives have been lost and billions of dollars have been spent, what's been achieved? In the first part of the discussion, we'll be looking at the endemic corruption in Afghan politics, at the position of women in Afghan society, and at the critical levels of opium production in the poppy fields of Afghanistan. With me in the studio is Sam Dathi from the Stop the War Coalition, Hamid Kabir, CEO of the Ariana Group, and joining me on Skype is Angela Mee, Director of Research at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and on the phone from Afghanistan, Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch. But first, let's take a look at this report.
Opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan has hit a record high within the very space British troops prepare to withdraw from, Helmand province, where 50% of the crop is harvested. The illicit sources of income the opium economy generates may well endanger the recovery of the Afghan state if the government remains unresponsive to the problem. The area under poppy, according to the United Nations Anti-Drugs Agency, is 36% higher than in 2012 and eclipses the previous record set in 2000. Total output has therefore arisen by 49% in the last 20 years. The question that raises itself concerns how the opium boom may impinge on Afghani civilians and whether the withdrawal of British forces will affect the production of opium. Thinking back to 2001 reveals that the curtailment of the opium trade was a central reason behind the deployment of British troops by Tony Blair. Having fallen short of this objective, one only wonders what has been achieved by the war. As a result of producing more than 90% of the world's opium, Afghanistan has become one of the world's largest consumers of heroin. Non-smokers are equally as affected, namely women and children. The lack of stability poppy cultivation has created in the civilian economy, alongside the detrimental long-term consequences of the decade-long civil war, has made life increasingly unbearable for the Afghan nation.
At this moment of transition, we need to make sure that the international and regional communities are helping Afghanistan to make a big choice today. Is this country to go in the direction of an illicit economy? Or is this country to be underpinned by the illicit economy as we all wish it would be? And we should not leave Afghanistan just by itself to do so.
The fact of the matter is that all political factions, including the government, benefit from the poppy trade. The revenue it provides could even tip over the balance of power if warring factions compete for the ownership of the Helmand fields following the final withdrawal of British soldiers. Is the West losing the war on opium? And to what extent has the anti-opium campaign worked to resolve the matter? Or has the war simply exasperated the conflict? Nazli Tazi, Islam Channel.
Well, Hamid, let me just ask you about that issue raised in the video there. How big an impact on the economy is the opium production, and what effect does it have on the society?
I think it's very important to look at a holistic view because the impact on the economy is hard to measure. Number one, I think the one method I can think of is to take the illicit economy, the amount of output, and whatever is remaining we import by way of from drug derived money. So obviously it's a huge and considerable industry. I think. From what I gather, there are nearly 8 million people directly or indirectly are involved in the industry. So one wonders if it was actually the number of laboratories are on the rise. I think there are nearly 2,000 laboratories, quite sophisticated ones. If the government together with the international support, they failed to provide an alternative enterprise for farmers as well as those in the trade. Then it's on the rise, and I don't understand why there is so much fuss about the rise, because it was actually expected. This particular report from UN showing 36% rise this is, I think, backed by the fact that in 2011 there was a disease that affected all the fields and plants, and obviously the production was down, and the price has risen, and farmers were encouraged to grow more, and that's the result of it. So from one angle, it is revenue, it is a way of living for people. At the same time, there's side effects that unfortunately the consumption has risen in Afghanistan, and of course the social impact on family lives, in particular women and children, are not very encouraging. So unless there is a proper and solid alternative enterprise, I think from my point of view, it has never been a top priority to eradicate opium for the international forces and NATO. And therefore it's risen, and it's beyond control.
Okay, well, let me bring Heather Barr in. I mean, Heather, Hamid is saying it was never a priority, but it was certainly a well-publicised aim of the occupation at one point, that it would take on this issue, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think that one of the problems that happened in Afghanistan is that the international community was trying to achieve two completely incompatible goals at the same time. The international community wanted to try and stamp out the drugs trade, but they also wanted to achieve military victory over the Taliban. And to do that, they needed to keep local communities on their side to the greatest extent possible. And one way to alienate a local community immediately is to destroy their livelihoods by destroying their poppy fields. So there's always been a tension between the counter-narcotics effort and the military effort. And it's worth also considering how Afghanistan, in a sense, echoes failed eradication efforts in many other countries, and is sort of the most recent example of how drug eradication has not been an effective way to address the narcotics trade or issues of addiction.
Let me just bring in Angela Mee. I mean, Angela, your unit at the UN has published a report on corruption, which it shows still to be at very, very high levels in Afghanistan. How much of this do you think is related to the opium trade?
Well, what the survey that we conducted in Afghanistan showed that corruption is endemic, and so is really very high. We estimated that about 50% of the people that when they ask surveys, something that should be provided for free, they have to pay for it. So drugs is definitely not immune to corruption, and actually corruption helps the drug from the production to the trafficking, to the manufacturing, and to the transporting of drugs outside Afghanistan and throughout the whole regions in the world. So definitely it would be hard to think that drug trafficking is successful without corruption.
Sam, let me bring you in. I mean, do you think that Heather's right when she says that basically the occupying forces couldn't do two things at once? They couldn't fight a war and have any sensible role in the kind of reconstruction or management of civil society?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the priority of America and Britain was to rebuild Afghanistan or help the Afghan people. I mean, their priority, it's difficult to know what their priority was. I mean, they've given many different reasons, and they've kind of flip-flopped from one reason to another in the chaos that ensued following 2001. I mean, if their task was to get rid of Al-Qaeda, I mean, possibly there's Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but of course, Al-Qaeda have now spread to Pakistan, to Iraq, to the Maghreb, they're in the Gulf, they're in Syria, as we know. If their task was to help women, and they've at times said that was their task, at least one of their tasks, that's been a complete failure, as people like activists like Malala Joya have testified to. If their task was to get rid of the Taliban, we know that the Taliban are still a very formidable fighting force, not only in Pakistan, northwest Pakistan, but in great areas of Afghanistan. So really on every single task that they've put forward, they failed. Really their main priority was to hegemonize Afghanistan. The war has been one part of a broader strategy, the war on terror, to take control of the Middle East, Central Asia, and control the resources. But really, on any count, they failed, in my view.
I mean, what do you think about the link between the opium trade and corruption? Is that one of the major drivers, or would this level of corruption exist irrespective of that?
I think we need to look at history of how things evolved. Afghanistan had a thriving market and a functioning economy in the 80s. That was during the Soviet-backed government. And all of a sudden, that government was overthrown by the help of the entire international community altogether, and Soviet Union withdrew. Then we had basically an anarchy. There was a vacuum of power for nearly a decade. Then the Taliban came, they established themselves. So when the international community went into Afghanistan to invade and occupy, they didn't have a functioning institutions to rely on. So one of the things that I couldn't agree with Sam, they have built some institution. They are in place. Yes, they are corrupt, and this, whether it would still be without the opium trade, and if there is a positive correlation, I would say yes to an extent. For example, Afghanistan is probably on the list of countries that seizes opium consignments, is at the bottom of the list. Now, this probably is an irony, because the amount of opium being exported from Afghanistan should, the seizure should have been much greater. Iran, on the other hand, is ranking at the top. They are seizing nearly 80% of the opium in the world that is seized. So obviously, the traffickers have firm control over the government authorities, and hence they're not being detected, and there is not enough seizure.
Angela, do you think that that the levels of corruption that were reported are a product of the occupation, and that they are liable to be addressed after the occupation, or do you think this is something which is now so deep in the bone that it'll stay there for a very long time to come?
Well, it will stay as long as the institutions don't grow up and they don't develop a system to combat corruption inside the institutions themselves. I wouldn't say that the corruption is due to the international forces. Definitely, the business and the money that goes around in the economy definitely has a correlation with the international forces. But if we see the root causes of corruption, we see that is the human resources policy that institutions have, from the hiring of personnel that is corrupted in the government, and from the culture of corruption that there is within the institution, but also within the population. Because when we went and we look at the dynamics of the corruption, we see that is the people themselves that they promote these forms in order to have special favors. On the other side, there is no shame from the government official to use corrupted approaches to anything they do.
Heather, I mean, Sam was saying there have been a variety of different justifications over the years for the NATO occupation, and we've looked at a couple of them to reduce both corruption and the opium trade. But another was that it would improve the condition of Afghan women. What's the view from where you sit about how far that has or hasn't been achieved?
Well, I mean, it has been significantly achieved. I think that there's been far less progress than everyone would have hoped for in the optimistic days after the fall of the Taliban. But there's absolutely no question but that life is better for most Afghan women now than it was in 2001. There are millions of girls in school. About half of girls are in school now. The parliament is 28% women. There are 2 women ministers. Other women in the government, women in the military, in the police force, a new law that makes violence against women a crime and makes acts like rape, which actually weren't previously crimes in Afghanistan, crimes that are punishable by significant prison terms. So these are signs of important progress, but Afghanistan is still one of the most difficult places in the world to be a woman. It's still got high infant mortality, maternal mortality rates, violence against women, etc. And our real concern at the moment is that rather than the point that we're at now being, one stage in a long process of trying to gradually move toward gender equality, that actually we may be at a high point that we'll be going backwards from in the years ahead as the international community turns its back on Afghanistan and aid dries up and political pressure on the Afghan government to respect women's rights disappears. And I think we're seeing signs of that already. I think in the last 6 months we've seen a number of attacks on women's rights by different branches of the Afghan government, by the parliament, by the executive branch, by the judiciary, and unfortunately not much of a response from the international community in terms of pushback.
Sam, do you think on this issue what we're seeing is that because the Western powers made such an issue of this, that they had to make a change here, but that an occupation can't really alter the kind of political configuration of a society like this, and that when Heather says we may see rollback, that's because the occupation couldn't generate the kind of internal forces which would change the society fundamentally and for good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm of the opinion, as many people, that you can't, a nation cannot find emancipation by it being handed down by some big, bureaucratic imperial state from above, because there's a conflict of interest. If you look through history, all peoples have found democracy, have found emancipation, have found self-determination through struggle, by them engaging in struggle and taking power themselves, not from it being handed down from other forces which have completely different interests which are completely contradictory to those of the people. And yes, I think there will be rollback, and there will be an unravelling of any minor gains that have been made in the last several years. I don't think there's been many at all. Will unravel in time. We know that the Taliban continues to be a formidable fighting force, heavily subsidised from opium, from minerals, and they're not going to participate, I don't think, in the elections next year, because they don't see these new institutions as being legitimate, and the conflict will continue. I think the end of the occupation is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for the Afghan people finally being able to take possession of their own country. It'll take a long time, just like it took a long time for the English people when they had their revolution, back in the 17th century. It takes a long time, but things will never get better whilst imperialism is at the door of Afghanistan.
I mean, how much of a genuine transition do you think we're going to see? I mean, for instance, do you think, Sam's raised a question mark about whether or not the Taliban will be included in the process, although, and this is perhaps one of the deepest ironies of the situation, the Western powers are working very hard to get them into the process. And at the same time, it looks as if there will still be considerable numbers of Western troops there as advisors and as backup. So is the advertised turning point quite as big as perhaps people are led to believe?
Yes, I think the transition is quite genuine, simply for the economic reason. The war has become prohibitively expensive for the Americans and its allies. So they are desperate to have an exit strategy and as well as save their face, because they've correctly invested billions of dollars and lost lives and all the effort. So for them, the credibility is very important. And as for Taliban, we know that the candidates list for the election is final, and we haven't seen much progress on peacemaking with them. But having said that, there are phases in the campaigns that we think that they could bridge and reach out to the Taliban. So I think the picture doesn't look as gloomy as it is portrayed. We believe that with international backing and if the in the framework of strategic agreement that is signed between Afghanistan and United States, The security agreement is still under consideration. We have a Loya Jirga, the Grand Assembly, in a week's time, which will decide whether to sign that agreement. This is to decide on the American military bases to leave behind. Everybody is very optimistic. We think that it's going to happen, and it's a welcome strategy moving forward for Afghanistan. Otherwise, I think we will see again Afghanistan slipping into civil war and things we saw in the 90s. Yes, I think it's also if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of the U.S. and international forces to see here the opium cultivation is growing, it's on the rise. And if we were to, there are means to eradicate it. It's very simple, but it doesn't make economic sense, because if you take that enterprise altogether, there will be millions of people, and the crime rate and everything will be rise, and there is no alternative enterprise for them.
Let me just bring Angela in, because we're moving towards the end of the discussion. Angela, there was a civil war when the NATO invasion began. There was corruption. There was opium production. More than a decade on, are we back to square one?
Well, the situation of the opium definitely has not improved since when the NATO forces entered Afghanistan. But we have, I think, a different scenario today than we had before. Heather was probably rightly mentioned that there was an incompatible objective within the NATO forces and the eradication of opium and other objectives. I would say that today maybe we have a compatible objective between the international community that wants to help Afghanistan to increase their social and economic development. And within that objective, I see that is very compatible to support also Afghanistan to eradicate the production of opium, but also the use of opium and heroin in the country that is also a threat to the health of the country itself. So what is important today is to improve the situation is that we mainstream the counter-narcotics objective into the development and economic policy for Afghanistan, so that we can eradicate opium only if we address the root causes of the opium cultivation. So if we really address rural development where farmers have real alternatives to opium, and when we also improve the public health notions among the citizens of Afghanistan, so in terms of prevention of the use of drugs and of the treatment of the drug. So I see that the scenario in a way today is better than when it was, and so there is more hope for a success story.
Sam, last word on this as we move to the end of the programme. Do you think that for most people in the West who watch their governments go to war here, the inclusion of the Taliban in the government, or the attempt to include it even, is a sign of failure for the occupation?
Well, I think so. One of the reasons that America, Britain and others gave was to restore democracy, to remove Taliban, to bring a kind of Western institutions. Now that's clearly been a complete and utter failure. We said, Stop the War said that it would be difficult, and if not impossible, to get rid of the Taliban. This is something, as I say, that the people have to do themselves now.
OK, I'm going to have to leave it there. That's all we've got time for. But do rejoin us for the second part, where we'll be looking more at the international and regional dimensions of the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan.